We begin with an assessment of the client's active ankle dorsiflexion. He is using only muscle force and no external loads to push his right knee out as far as it will go over his toe. As we can see, the professional is using a stick to help guide the client as well. The professional is making sure that the client's knee is aligned with his foot. We don't want to see any cheating on this assessment. The professional has recorded that the client's ankle range of motion in dorsiflexion is about 10 centimeters, which is a measure of the distance from the client's toes to his outstretched knee indicated by the stick. Therefore, the client would earn a score of 2. Now we move on to the client's assessment of his left ankle's range of motion. Again, this is an active test, so only the individual's muscles are being used to extend his left knee over his left toes. Again, the professional is there to guide the client, making sure the client's knees and foot are aligned as well as record the results. In the professional's recordings of the results, the client's range of motion for his left ankle is about 7 centimeters. Therefore, the client receives a score of 1. Next, we move on to the assessment of the client's active hip flexion. The assessment begins with the client in supine position. He then slowly brings his right leg up as far as it will go, making sure that his right leg is as straight as possible. The professional wants to make sure that the client's other leg, the one remaining on the ground, has not lifted off the ground. To measure the client's results, we want to use the left leg as a reference. Where is the lateral malleolus, or the ankle joint of the test leg, in this case the right, in relation to the non-test leg, or the left? The professional has given the client a score of 2. This means that the right ankle is viewed to be between the knee and mid-thigh of the non-test leg. We can see from the video that the right ankle is between the knee and the mid-thigh of the grounded left leg. Now we want to assess the client's range of motion of his left hip. It is the same process as with the right leg. Supine position and lift the leg as much as it will go while keeping the leg as straight as possible. The client received a similar score of 2. We can see that the left ankle falls between the knee and mid-thigh of the right leg on the ground. Next, we move on to the assessment of a client's active shoulder flexion. We first begin with the client's right shoulder. He makes a fist and raises the arm directly over his head and flexes his elbow so that his fist is down the back as far as possible. The professional measures the fist length from the most prominent spine process, C7. The client's right fist is within half a fist below C7, so we would score 3. Now we switch over to the left fist, following the same criteria as with the right. We want to make sure that the client maintains a neutral back. As with the right fist, the client's left fist is within a half fist length below C7 and receives a score of 3. The next assessment is the assessment of passive mobility. In these assessments, the client's range of motion is pushed with the help of external forces. We begin with the passive assessment of the client's ankle dorsiflexion. Unlike with active mobility, we see the client take on a sort of half genuflect position. The professional measures the same distance as he did in the assessment of active mobility. The professional measured his left knee and was able to extend about 13 centimeters past his left toes, which results in a score of 4. Next, we want the client to perform the same exercise but with his right knee. The client was able to extend his knee about 11.5 centimeters past his toes, which correlates to a score of 3. We then move on to the passive assessment of the client's hip flexion. The client should be in the same position as with the active hip flexion, and he performs the same motion, the only difference being that the professional aids the client in his range of motion. The professional makes sure that the client's right leg is as straight as possible and that the client's grounded leg remains on the ground. The client is then instructed to switch legs so that the left leg is in the air and the right leg remains on the ground. Again, the professional makes sure that the left leg is straight while the right leg remains flat on the ground. Both legs result in a score of 2. Lastly, we are assessing passive shoulder flexion. The same process is used as with active test, the only difference being is that the client is aided by the professional. We see the professional guide the client's right fist to reach farther past C7. The resulting score is a 4 because the client was able to reach a full fist length below C7. The same process is used to assess the passive mobility of the client's left shoulder. We see that the client's left fist was able to be within a half fist length below C7, which results in a score of 3. Now we are finished assessing both active and passive mobility. Typically, a client's passive results will be greater than their active results. Our next step is assessing the client's stability. To do this, we will be using the Y balance test. The client's shoes are off and his left foot is in the center of the Y. He extends his right leg and subsequently the object in an anterior, posteromedial, and posterolateral direction. The client was able to push the object while on his left leg in an anterior direction of about 60 centimeters. He was able to push the object in a posteromedial direction of about 62 centimeters and about 52 centimeters in a posterolateral direction. Notice how the client always returns back to the starting position. The client's composite score for his left leg is about 57. We perform the same activity with the right foot in the center of the Y and the left foot extending the objects. The client was able to push the object about 62 centimeters in the anterior direction, 66 centimeters in the posteromedial direction, and 73 centimeters in the posterolateral direction. Again, we notice that the client is returning back to the starting position after moving the objects. The client's composite score for his right leg is about 66. This concludes that the client has better stability on his right leg than on his left.
In the first test of ankle dorsiflexion, the client had a significantly greater passive range of motion, as his scores for active were 2 points for the right knee and 1 point for the left knee, and for passive he scored 3 points for the right knee and 4 points for the left knee. In the hip flexion test, our client scored 2 points for the right and left in both active and passive. In the final test of shoulder flexion, our client showed a very slight difference in his passive and active mobility, as his scores were both 3 points in the left shoulder, but 3 points in the right for active and 4 points in the right for passive. Overall, our client showed a slightly greater passive range of motion. This was expected, as it is usually greater because there is an external force directing the movement of the joint rather than only an internal force. For the second question, I believe that both the client's passive and active mobility influenced their Y-balance test results. In both the client's active and passive tests at the ankles, hip, and shoulders, the right side consistently had a greater range of motion. As we also saw in the client's Y-balance test, his right leg was dominant, meaning that he had a greater balance on the right leg. With his stability, he was able to reach farther and gather much better results. During the Y-balance test, he is practicing passive mobility as an external force of gravity is being exerted on him. The client got a composite score of 57 for the left leg and a score of 66 for the right leg, showing a greater range of motion in the right side. These results directly correlate with the passive results of motion of the right ankle, hip, and shoulder, which were greater than those of the left. For the third question, I would use the active and passive hip flexion tests as well as the Y-balance test to assess the mobility and stability of client C. Georgia, who just turned 73 and recently had a right hip replacement, should be tested for range of motion of the hip. After carefully testing Georgia, a proper plan could be made to help Georgia in beginning to exercise. As her range of motion could be limited in her right hip, these tests would greatly benefit her and provide her with the reassurance that the plan made for her will suit her needs for exercise as well as her limits.